Hi, Paul. How are you?
Hi, Mark. I'm really well. How are you doing?
Yeah, good, thanks. Yeah, we were going to talk today about how much can the hand take, with me as a hand surgeon, as you as a guitar pedagogue.
Yeah, because it's something that, well, both you and I, maybe from different angles, deal with a lot. And what I really want to ask you is when we talk about hands and what they're able to do, what are the main key features that you look at and that comes to mind when you're working with your patients and particularly guitarists?
Well, yeah, I always ask patients if they're guitarists, what instruments they play, whether they play 12-string guitars, electric guitars, what the action's like, and whether they, these we were just earlier talking about 7-string basses and things like that. So you find people play most surprising instruments which need big reaches. And 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 what I really am keen to find out is, has anything changed lately that they've come to see me? Have they been practicing a lot more for some big difficult repertoire thing that's coming up, maybe a finals recital or something like that? Or have they taken on a new instrument with a difficult action? Have they started learning new chords? Um, those sorts of things, really. Just has the hand had to do anything that it isn't accustomed to? Because that's usually when it fails.
Yeah. And and what do you think of those that you just mentioned there? What do you think is the most common thing that you see amongst the issue you just mentioned?
Um, the commonest condition I see in musicians generally is trigger finger, which is just flexor tendonitis. All these, each of your tendons, each of your fingers has two tendons in it, which then all come through the carpal tunnel down here. And if the tendons are swollen, they can do a couple of things to mess you up. There's one to the thumb. They can jam in the pulleys and cause triggering. And grade one triggering is when it just goes like that. And grade two triggering is when you have to pull it out. And grade three is when it's got stuck and you can't get it back. And that's just because the tendon's swollen and it won't go into the first pulley as you want to straighten your finger out like that. And then as they all bunch together and they come into the carpal tunnel down here, um, they can squeeze the median nerve, which supplies the thumb and these two fingers and half of this one. And if it squeezes that, it gives you pain, but it also gives you numbness in the fingers. And actually, you squash the carpal tunnel a little bit more by bending the wrist like that. That's called Phelan's test. And people do that if they've got, a very low neck position and they're doing bar chords or something like that. And so I do find that people, it's one of the early failure things is that they can't do their bar chords or their long chords anymore. Yeah, so those are all common. Yeah, and then I see some patients with Dupuytren's contracture as well who can't spread their hands very far, or they're getting arthritis at the base of their thumb because it's just worn out, and they can't reach as far as they'd like to. So they have difficulties with long reaches.
One of the things that I know you and I have talked about a lot is also the psychology, and that links to the terms of how high your pain threshold
Yeah,
is.
yeah,
And what are your thoughts about that?
yeah. I see it. Well, so people will come with everything from the most difficult to find pathology, where all the scans are normal, through to situations where everything's abnormal. They've got arthritis, they've got nerve conduction studies with lots of changes on their nerve function, and the ultrasound shows lots of synovitis, and they may not actually be that symptomatic. So that leads you to think, well, what's going on here? And there's quite a lot of psychology involved, and you as a psychologist would sort of appreciate that. But so essentially, what happens is that people will sometimes catastrophize, say, "Oh my God, I've got this tiny thing going on in my hand. What's it going to turn into? And is it going to stop me being doing that big concert that's coming up next month?" And then, of course, there's all the theory of pain, which means that you can amplify that in your mind, and that will certainly have a very bad negative feedback loop, which will take you down a negative spiral of thinking about pain. Um, and then there's a much more positive way of approaching it, which is that it's likely to be okay and you're likely to be able to carry on. But that's a gross generalization. There are other conditions where people genuinely have something which is difficult to find and they really can't carry on, and it's nothing to do with their psychology. So yeah, you and I have talked about these domains of where the treatment lies before, whether it's going to be with sharp things, with me putting sharp things through people's skins, needles and knives, or whether it's going to be a hand therapist, strapping, taping, support, strengthening, etc., looking at technique, ergonomics, and then, or whether it's going to be technique with you. And then there's the other stuff that sports people have that I've tried to translate over into musicians, which is sleep, nutrition, psychology, and all these things are pulled in as needed if a more complex picture emerges.
I think that sort of holistic approach that you're talking about, that's obviously right up my street, and it's exactly what I also advocate. And I want to tell you something interesting, because it's never too late learning, but actually in relation to the hands as well. I've recently taken up yoga,
Yeah.
which in some ways links well to what I've done before in terms of exercise and so on. But what I discovered by doing yoga for just 2 weeks and taking the exercise home is that if I implement this into my guitar playing, thinking about this way of moving and developing flow, it has become much easier, which anyone who does yoga and music will say, well, of course. But that is really interesting, that
You're
thinking
also
about
a,
that
you're
is
also
actually another way of dealing with avoiding pain.
Yeah, well, you're an Alexander Technique enthusiast as well,
Yeah.
aren't you?
Yes.
And how does the yoga link in with Alexander Technique?
Well, it's very interesting because Alexander himself was very much against yoga because he wasn't keen in those sort of fixed positions, which I can understand. But actually, you don't have to sit in fixed positions when you do yoga, because you can do what they call, I guess, without being an expert, yoga flow, which is what I have done. So continuous exercise. And I think if we can link that particular to the classic guitar, because the bizarre thing about classic guitarists is that they often sit very still because of the way they sit the instrument.
Yeah.
And obviously, from a physiological point of view, that is not a good thing to be in a locked position. So what I have tried to incorporate, what I have learned from yoga, is putting flow and a bit of movement into my playing, and it has made a huge difference.
Do you naturally always take breaks as well, Paul?
Yes, and we have talked about this. For me, a long, as you
Yeah.
know, practicing session is just a couple of minutes if it's a technical thing. But that, of course, has to be scaled up, as you just talked about before, if you're doing live concerts, because you're playing
Yeah.
for 45 minutes times two.
Well, yes, of course, yeah. Well, as you know, I'm a keen amateur trumpet player as well, and I often find myself sitting for 45 minutes without moving. I'm very bad at it, and I can understand when you get obsessed with one thing that you particularly want to learn, how you can get stuck in that. So I'm as bad as the next man. But for the moment, I don't actually have any musculoskeletal problem, but I suppose that's just waiting to happen.
Mm.
Yeah, so I think it's very important that people do take breaks, particularly if they're coming up against some sort of musculoskeletal failure. So, yeah, to come back to the subject we were meant to be talking about, how much can the hand take? Basically, musculoskeletal failure occurs, in my experience, when people just have a step change in their activity, and something new comes along, and it just starts to hurt a lot. And it's often below the threshold of imaging to pick it up, often called overuse syndrome. But it's amazing how much the hand can take if you gradually get stronger and you stay within your normal comfort range and you gradually train yourself up without ever sort of going through those step changes. Really.
There's one thing that I'm not very keen on, and that's for guitar players to do stretching exercises on the hand that they put on the fretboard, because in my opinion, stretching your hand above its limit is actually unnatural. So I find different ways of playing the same thing on the guitar with. What's your thoughts about that?
Well, I don't know enough about technique to know whether guitarists for a certain type of repertoire absolutely need to stretch. I mean, there are some. I've met some guitarists that tell me that their big thing that they're known for is the fact that they can do long stretch chords, and it gives them some sort of kudos within the guitar world. Is that a thing?
Yes, and I think what guitar players need to be aware of is that it depends on the size of your hand, and that there may be some natural limitations. So, for example, I have a very small hand compared to some other guitarists, and therefore I have to find different ways of playing the same thing,
Mm.
but with a different type of technique to avoid getting into developing pain.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Well, yeah. We better keep this fairly brief, I suppose. And so I suppose that covers most of the things we wanted to talk about, doesn't it?
Absolutely. It was really nice to chat to you again. Thank you so much, Mark.
Yeah. All right. Good to see you. Bye now.